What's up, YouTube? It's just a little update to start with. The winners of those MP3 transmitters. I was a little late getting the packages out. Actually, I was waiting for one guy to get his address to me, and then I realized I missed your address. And then, so anyway, packages will be going out. They're going to take some time to get across the border to the guys down in the US. And Benjamin, I already met him, and he got his transmitter already, so congrats again to all three of you. And then Blue Dog, you're getting a package too. So the block, going to continue on today. Going to install the aftermarket motor mounts that we have for this block. Tyler, he picked up some Beatrush, more of a solid mount. And so they have to be the brackets have to come off these mounts, these brackets we need, and the Beatrush mounts will attach right to those brackets. We'll get those bolted on, and then I think I might turn it around and maybe set the heater on the bottom of it a little bit to warm up the bottom of the block, and possibly get the oil pan to seal on there. So I've got to kind of open up the oil pan box and see what kind of pickup needs to be installed. So I've just been trying to warm up the bottom of the block a little bit. It was just really cold to the touch, and now, I mean, it's not warm, but it's definitely not cold. More, I would say, what room temperature is now. So I decided, well, we're going to start with the oil pan. I want to close this up, but then I realized, well, there's 2 bolts that I needed to get from the old engine, so I had to pop the oil pan off of it. I figured they'd supply all the hardware that you need, but because we're using the Killer Bee oil pan, with the Killer Bee oil pickup, we can use the spacers to actually lower the pickup further down into the pan, and so there is 2 longer bolts to actually hold part of the pickup. Well, actually for all of the pickup, but they don't provide the other bolts that you need to hold the actual windage plate down. So I had to grab the 2 factory bolts from the other engine just to hold this guy down. And I guess that's where we're going to start. This guy's going to go on first. Basically gets placed down inside like that. The pickup will go on next, and the spacers, of course, to actually bolt it on. It's got all long bolts to bolt on for the spacers, and then you just use the 2 factory bolts up here in the back of the engine, and then we'll be ready to put some gray RTV around and seal this up. They do provide new bolts, new hardware for the oil pan, and they have a pretty good instruction sheet for actually how it's installed and what the torque settings are. And at this point, you definitely want to be careful putting the hardware in, because if it falls down inside, most likely you're going to have to take this plate back off just so you can get it to fall back out of there. Now we can place the spacers for the pickup. So they have a new flange for the actual pickup tube, and then just these 2 little blocks to raise the or to lower the bracket for the pickup. And then the pickup will just sit right on top of all this. And then they provide some longer bolts to actually put everything down. These blue longer bolts go into the pickup tube flange. You also need to make sure those O-rings are in there. Hey Siri. Convert 7.5 foot-pounds to inch-pounds.
7.5 feet is 90 inches.
7.5 foot-pounds is what all these bolts should go down to. Let me just double check these flange bolts. That's together. So now that this is all basically in place and torqued down, I can go ahead and start adding some sealant to the oil pan. So I do have some ultra gray that I'm going to use. I'm going to apply it to the oil pan just because I can get a better idea of where it needs to go, and then just very cautiously guide the oil pan down over the pickup and let it sit on the block for a little bit. Let the ultra gray set for a little while, and then I'll be winding in the bolts and torquing those down. So when I do something like this, I generally like to put on a glove and literally finger paint the sealant on, and then I can really feel how thick it is everywhere. And as long as I have good coverage going across the whole area, I've never had a problem. I've never had a leaking oil pan from doing something like this. Subaru might use almost as much sealant because these pans are very difficult to crack loose from a factory engine. You can almost be taking like a scraper and basically chiseling it to try and separate it from the block, and you'll get the whole one side and it still won't come loose. So they like a lot of sealant, and just having about this much, it shouldn't bleed out of the edges too much. Just leave a nice little a tiny little bead maybe going around. So I'll let that sit for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then should be ready to apply it. So it's probably close to 10 minutes later. The stuff is still damp feeling, but I can feel it's very, very tacky. So without touching anything or touching any of the sealant, I'm going to try and guide this down. Just give it a little wiggle to make sure the sealant is applied everywhere, and just start threading in these new Allen head bolts by hand. So it's kind of hard to tell what size Allen key or hex socket you need here, but I'm using a metric 5. It seems to fit really well. So they want all the oil pan bolts that they provide torqued to the factory spec, 5 foot-pounds, which I converted to 60 inch-pounds, and basically just in a crisscross pattern until they're all torqued, and then I'll probably swing around just make sure they're all torqued at the proper setting. So now that the oil pan's all on, torqued in place, you can actually see just a tiny little bead of the RTV coming out all the way around. That's how you know you got an awesome seal. You don't want it just globbing out all over the place because the same thing's happening on the inside. So just that thin skim all the way around, just finger painted on is the best way I found to seal an oil pan. So now that that's all done, we can move on to these Beatrush engine mounts. Very solid application. Something I've noticed is this hardware is a little bit loose, so you definitely want to tighten it before you get that engine into the car and it's running, because that bolt chatters its way out and you're going to know it real fast. So I basically have to take these plates off of the factory mounts, and it's just those two nuts on the other side. These are offset a little bit, and you want to make sure you get them properly back in place. But if you look at these two studs, this stud is offset to the right side a little bit, and as you can see, the center of this stud can be turned 180 degrees. So this mount would go into that mounting bracket like this to be installed properly. So there's the new Beatrush mount attached to the factory bracket, and this one would attach on this side just like that. And I think I'm going to actually wind the bolts in, because I should be able to tighten these bolts with it installed on the block. So the bolts that hold the mount to the bracket are torqued at 31 foot-pounds. The bolts holding the bracket to the block are 26 foot-pounds. And then, just for the sake of knowing, the nuts that hold the mounts to the subframe are 62 foot-pounds. So I'm just going to torque these guys to the block. And now we'll just tighten up these 4 bolts. We'll be good. So the hardware for these is 17mm on both sides. The instructions that came with these Beatrush mounts, pretty much all in Japanese. There was an instruction manual, and it was just caution, caution, protection, caution. So yeah, that certainly fancies up the block quite a bit. Oil pan and mounts being on. Just still waiting on some stuff. Pretty much almost ready to torque the heads on. So I would expect that Thursday's video, I'm at least going to torque on show you torquing on one side, and we'll get to drill the heads, install the new gaskets, and see how everything goes together. Kind of anxious to actually get this thing sealed up and get it prepared to get back in the car. but I'm making half decent time for the time I have to actually spend on it. So if you like this video, definitely give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button for me. Leave your questions and comments further down below, and I'll see you in the next one.